The scorching sun hammered down on the endless expanse of a rocky desert, creating waves of heat that made the horizon dance like a mirage. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead as he checked his watch for the 20th time in the past hour. The convoy should have reached the checkpoint by now, but all he could see stretching before him was sand, rocks, and the occasional thorny bush that somehow managed to survive in this hellish landscape. "Sir, we've got a problem," called out Corporal Jamie Rodriguez from the driver's seat of their Humvee. His voice carried that particular tension that every soldier learns to recognize, the kind that means trouble is coming fast and hard. Chen moved quickly to the front of the vehicle, his boots crunching on the small stones scattered across the desert floor. Through the dusty windshield, he could see what Rodriguez was pointing at. About 2 miles ahead, black smoke was rising into the clear blue sky like a funeral pyre. It was thick, oily smoke, the kind that comes from burning vehicles. "Get Captain Morrison on the radio," Chen ordered, his mind already racing through possibilities. None of them were good. The radio crackled to life, filled with static and the distant sound of voices shouting over each other. Morrison's voice cut through the chaos, but it was strained and urgent. "All units, this is Bravo 6. We have a situation at grid reference 77 Alpha. Multiple casualties, vehicles disabled, requesting immediate medical evacuation and support." Chen felt his stomach drop. The convoy they were supposed to meet wasn't just late, they were in serious trouble. He grabbed the handset and pressed the transmit button. "Bravo 6, this is Echo 4. We're approximately 2 clicks south of your position. What's your status?" The response came back immediately, but it wasn't from Morrison. It was Sergeant First Class Williams, the convoy's senior NCO, and his voice was tight with pain. "Echo 4, Bravo 6 is down. We hit an improvised explosive device about 30 minutes ago. The captain's unconscious, we've got 3 wounded, and our vehicles are toast. We're in a bad spot here." Rodriguez looked at Chen with wide eyes. They both knew what this meant. The convoy was stranded in hostile territory with wounded soldiers and no way to move. The nearest friendly base was 40 miles away, and the desert between here and there was crawling with insurgents who would love nothing more than to capture or kill a group of isolated American soldiers. "Williams, how many are you?" Chen asked into the radio. 5 walking wounded, 3 serious casualties, including the captain. We've got some supplies, but not enough water for more than a day in this heat." Chen closed his eyes for a moment, thinking fast. 8 soldiers, some badly hurt, stuck in the middle of nowhere with limited supplies. The temperature was already over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would only get hotter as the day wore on. Without adequate water, heat exhaustion and dehydration would start taking them down within hours. "Copy that, Williams. We're moving to your position now. Hang tight." As Rodriguez gunned the engine and they began racing across the desert toward the smoke, Chen got back on the radio to contact their base. "Charlie Base, this is Echo 4. We have a code red situation at grid 77 Alpha. Convoy Bravo is down with multiple casualties and disabled vehicles, requesting immediate CASEVAC and reinforcements." The response from base was not what he wanted to hear. "Echo 4, Charlie Base. All CASEVAC birds are committed to operations in Fallujah. Earliest possible extraction is 1800 hours. Can you maintain position and provide security until then?" Chen looked at his watch. It was barely noon. 6 hours might as well be 6 days in this heat with wounded soldiers and limited water. "Negative, Charlie Base. We don't have the supplies to sustain 8 additional personnel for 6 hours in these conditions. We need that bird now." "Understood, Echo 4, but there's nothing available. Hold your position and do what you can. We'll get someone to you as soon as possible." The radio went dead, leaving Chen staring at the handset in disbelief. He'd been in the army for 12 years, fought in Afghanistan and 2 tours in Iraq, but he'd never felt quite as abandoned as he did at that moment. Somewhere behind the calm, professional voice of the radio operator at Charlie Base, he could hear the unspoken truth. They were on their own. As their Humvee crested a small rise, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The convoy had been traveling through a narrow valley between 2 rocky hills when the IED had detonated. The lead vehicle, a heavily armored Humvee, was completely destroyed. Its twisted metal frame was still smoking, and the sand around it was stained dark with oil and other fluids Chen didn't want to think about too closely. The second vehicle had been damaged but was still partially intact. Chen could see soldiers moving around it, some helping others who were sitting or lying in whatever shade they could find. It wasn't much shade, just the shadow cast by the damaged Humvee, but it was better than being directly exposed to the relentless sun. Rodriguez brought their vehicle to a stop about 50 yards away, positioning it so they had a clear view of the surrounding area. Chen jumped out before the Humvee had completely stopped moving, his medic bag already in his hand. The heat hit him like a physical blow, and he could feel the moisture being sucked out of his lungs with every breath. Sergeant Williams met him halfway, limping slightly on his left leg. His uniform was torn and bloody, but he was moving under his own power. "Glad to see you, Sergeant," he said, shaking Chen's hand firmly. "Things have been better." "Give me a sitrep," Chen said, already moving toward the wounded soldiers. Captain Morrison took a piece of shrapnel to the head when the IED went off. He's been unconscious since it happened. Private Johnson has a compound fracture of his left arm and possible internal injuries. Corporal Martinez has severe burns on his hands and arms from trying to pull Johnson out of the burning vehicle. Williams led him to where the wounded soldiers were lying in the minimal shade. Captain Morrison was pale and still, his breathing shallow but steady. Someone had bandaged the head wound, but Chen could see blood seeping through the gauze. Johnson was conscious but in obvious pain, his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. Martinez was sitting up, his arms wrapped in field dressings that were already stained with fluid from his burns. Chen knelt beside Morrison first, checking his pulse and examining the head wound as best he could without moving him too much. The captain needed immediate medical attention that Chen simply couldn't provide in the field. Johnson's arm needed to be properly set and splinted, and Martinez required treatment for his burns that was beyond the scope of basic field medicine. "What's our water situation?" Chen asked as he worked. Williams grimaced. "Not good. We lost most of our water when the lead vehicle blew. Between all of us, we've got maybe 6 canteens left. In this heat, that won't last more than a few hours." Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert temperature. Water was life in this environment, and they didn't have enough to keep 11 people alive until the promised evening evacuation. He'd seen men die from heat stroke and dehydration before, and it wasn't a pleasant way to go. The human body could only survive a few hours without water in this kind of heat. "Sergeant, we need to talk," Williams said quietly, pulling Chen aside. "I've been thinking about our options, and none of them are good. We can try to make it to the nearest village, but that's 15 miles across open desert with wounded men who can barely walk. We can stay here and hope the cavalry arrives before we all die of thirst, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Chen knew what he was thinking. They could abandon the most seriously wounded and try to get the others to safety. It was a tactical decision that commanders had been forced to make throughout military history, but that didn't make it any easier to contemplate. "We're not leaving anyone behind," Chen said firmly. "There has to be another way." As he spoke, Rodriguez came running over from their Humvee, his radio handset in his hand. "Sergeant, you need to hear this. I was monitoring the emergency frequency, and I picked up something weird." Chen took the handset and listened. Through the static, he could hear a faint transmission in what sounded like code. It was brief and cryptic, but it was definitely American military traffic. Someone was out there, operating in the area, and they were using encrypted communications. "Could be a patrol," Williams suggested hopefully. Chen shook his head. Regular patrols didn't use that level of encryption for routine traffic. This was something else, something classified. He'd heard similar transmissions before, during his time attached to special operations units in Afghanistan. The pattern and frequency suggested special operations command traffic, possibly Delta Force or another elite unit operating in the area. But special ops units didn't typically respond to routine calls for help from regular Army soldiers. They had their own missions, their own priorities, and getting involved in a rescue operation could compromise whatever they were doing in the area. Chen had worked with special forces before, and while he respected their capabilities, he knew they operated by different rules than regular units. Still, it was worth a try. He keyed the radio and transmitted on the frequency where they'd heard the encrypted traffic. Any station, this is Echo 4 Actual with emergency traffic. We have multiple casualties at Grid 77 Alpha and require immediate assistance. Over." For a long moment there was nothing but static. Then a voice came back, calm and professional, but with an edge that suggested these weren't regular soldiers. "Echo 4 Actual, this is Guardian Angel. We copy your transmission. Stand by." "Guardian Angel." Chen had never heard that call sign before, but something about the way the operator spoke told him these were the people he'd hoped to reach. There was a confidence in that voice, a sense that whatever situation they were facing, Guardian Angel had the capability to handle it. Guardian Angel, Echo 4 Actual. We have 8 casualties, including 3 urgent surgical, stranded in open desert with minimal water and no transportation. Requesting immediate CASEVAC or other assistance. Our situation is deteriorating rapidly. Echo 4 Actual, Guardian Angel. We understand your situation. Maintain your current position and prepare to mark your location with smoke when directed. Help is coming. The transmission ended, leaving Chen staring at the radio. He didn't know who Guardian Angel was, but something in that operator's voice gave him hope for the first time since they'd discovered the destroyed convoy. These people, whoever they were, sounded like they knew what they were doing. Williams looked at him questioningly. Think they'll actually show up? Chen shrugged, but he was already feeling more optimistic. I don't know who they are, but they didn't sound like the kind of people who make promises they can't keep. As the afternoon wore on and the temperature continued to climb, Chen and the other soldiers did what they could to keep the wounded men stable and conserve their remaining water. They rigged a makeshift shelter using ponchos and whatever materials they could salvage from the damaged vehicles, creating a slightly larger area of shade where the wounded could rest. Captain Morrison remained unconscious, his condition unchanged but stable. Johnson was in increasing pain from his broken arm, but he was alert and responsive. Martinez was having trouble with his burned hands, unable to grip anything or perform basic tasks for himself. The other 5 soldiers from the convoy had various cuts, bruises, and minor injuries, but they were mobile and able to help with the care of their more seriously wounded comrades. Every few minutes, Chen found himself checking his watch and scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching vehicles or aircraft. The desert remained empty and silent, except for the occasional gust of wind that stirred up small dust devils and made the heat shimmer even more intensely. By mid-afternoon, their water situation was becoming critical. Chen had implemented strict rationing, allowing each man only small sips at regular intervals, but even with careful conservation, their supply would be exhausted before evening. Several of the soldiers were already showing early signs of heat exhaustion, headaches, nausea, and increasing fatigue that went beyond normal tiredness. Rodriguez was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, hopping to pick up some indication of approaching help, when he suddenly straightened up and held up his hand for silence. Sergeant, I'm getting something. Chen moved quickly to the radio, pressing the headphone to his ear. At first, all he could hear was the usual static and background noise. Then very faintly, he detected the sound of rotors in the distance. It was still far away, but it was definitely getting closer. Guardian Angel, this is Echo 4 Actual, Chen transmitted. Are you inbound to our location? Echo 4 Actual, Guardian Angel. We have eyes on your position. Pop smoke now. Chen grabbed a smoke grenade from his vest and pulled the pin, tossing it into the open area near their position. Bright orange smoke began billowing up into the still air, creating a visible marker that could be seen for miles in the clear desert atmosphere. The sound of rotors was getting louder now, and Chen could make out multiple aircraft approaching from the north. As they got closer, he could see they weren't the standard medevac helicopters he'd expected. These were sleek, fast-moving aircraft that he didn't immediately recognize, definitely military, but not the usual army birds he was familiar with. The lead helicopter circled their position once, obviously surveying the scene and assessing the situation. Then it settled into a landing approach, kicking up enormous clouds of sand and dust as it touched down about 100 yards from the damaged convoy. As the dust began to settle, Chen could see figures moving quickly from the aircraft. They were dressed in desert camouflage, but their equipment and bearing immediately identified them as special operations personnel. These weren't regular soldiers. They moved with the practiced efficiency of elite troops who had conducted countless similar operations. The team leader approached Chen at a fast walk, his rifle held in a ready position but not directly threatening. He was a tall, lean man with intense eyes and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years of hard service in difficult places. Sergeant Chen, he asked, somehow knowing Chen's name without being told. That's right, you Guardian Angel. The man nodded curtly. Major Sullivan, but you can call me Guardian Angel. We're here to get you out of this mess. Chen felt a surge of relief so strong it almost knocked him off his feet. These people, whoever they were, had appeared out of nowhere just when the situation was becoming desperate. But even as he felt grateful, part of his mind was wondering how they had known his name and how they had gotten to this remote location so quickly. "Sir, we've got 3 urgent surgical cases and 5 walking wounded. They need immediate medical attention." Sullivan was already moving toward the wounded soldiers, his team spreading out to provide security and assess the casualties. "We've got a full medical team standing by. Let's get these men loaded and out of here." As Chen watched the special operations team work with practiced efficiency to prepare the wounded for transport, he realized that this rescue was far more than just a lucky coincidence. These men had been prepared for this exact situation, and they had capabilities and resources that went far beyond what he'd expected from a random patrol happening to be in the area. But questions about who Guardian Angel really was and how they had managed to appear at exactly the right moment would have to wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting his wounded soldiers to safety before the desert heat claimed any more casualties. Major Sullivan's team moved with the kind of precision that only comes from years of training and real-world experience. Within minutes of landing, they had established a secure perimeter around the crash site and begun the process of triaging and preparing the wounded for transport. Chen watched in amazement as the team's medic, a compact woman with sergeant's stripes and hands that moved like a surgeon's, quickly assessed each casualty with an efficiency that made Chen's own field medicine training look elementary. "Your Captain Morrison has a severe concussion and possible skull fracture," she reported to Sullivan without looking up from her examination. "He needs immediate neurosurgical evaluation. The one with the compound fracture has internal bleeding that I can't assess here, and the burn victim is at risk for infection and fluid loss. All 3 need to be at a trauma center within the hour." Sullivan nodded grimly. "Can they handle transport?" "If we move fast and keep them stabilized, yes, but we can't delay." Chen noticed that none of the special operations team seemed surprised by the casualties they were dealing with. They worked as if they had been briefing on this exact situation, their movements coordinated and purposeful in a way that suggested this wasn't their first rescue mission. The team's communication was minimal but highly effective. A few hand signals, brief verbal confirmations, and everyone knew exactly what their role was. "Sergeant Chen," Sullivan called out, motioning him over to where the team had set up what looked like a mobile command center. "I need you to understand something. This operation is classified at the highest levels. What you and your men have seen here today never happened. As far as any official record is concerned, you were rescued by a routine medevac helicopter that happened to be in the area." Chen stared at him. "Sir, I don't understand. Who are you people?" Sullivan's expression didn't change, but Chen caught a glance between him and another team member, a hard-looking man with the build of a professional athlete and scars that suggested he'd seen serious combat. "We're the people who handle situations that don't officially exist, Sergeant. Right now, you and your men are part of something bigger than a simple convoy attack." Before Chen could ask what he meant, Rodriguez came running over from their Humvee, his face pale with excitement and fear. "Sergeant, you need to hear this. I've been monitoring insurgent radio traffic and they're talking about the attack on our convoy, but that's not the weird part." Chen felt his stomach tighten. "What's the weird part?" "They knew we were coming. They knew the convoy route, the timing, even the number of vehicles. This wasn't a random IED placement, sir. This was a planned ambush, and somehow they had intelligence about our movement." Sullivan stepped closer, his demeanor suddenly much more intense. "What exactly did you hear?" Rodriguez glanced nervously at Chen, who nodded for him to continue. "The transmissions were in Arabic, but I speak enough to get the basics. They were coordinating with someone who had real-time information about American military operations. Someone was feeding them intelligence, sir." The implications hit Chen like a physical blow. If Rodriguez was right, then Captain Morrison's convoy hadn't just been unlucky enough to hit a roadside bomb. They had been deliberately targeted by insurgents who had inside information about their mission. That meant there was a leak somewhere in the American command structure, someone who was passing operational details to the enemy. Sullivan exchanged another look with his team member, and Chen saw something pass between them that confirmed his worst suspicions. These special operations soldiers weren't just here for a rescue mission. They were here because they had suspected something like this might happen. Major, did you know this was going to happen? Chen asked directly. Sullivan was quiet for a moment, watching as his team continued to prepare the wounded for evacuation. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. We've been tracking intelligence leaks in this sector for the past 3 months. Someone with access to operational planning has been selling information to insurgent groups. We had indications that today's convoy might be targeted. Chen felt anger rising in his chest. Then why didn't you warn us? Why didn't you stop the convoy from leaving? Because we needed to identify the source of the leak, Sullivan replied calmly. If we had canceled the mission, whoever is feeding information to the insurgents would have known we were onto them. They would have changed their methods, covered their tracks, and continued compromising operations indefinitely. The cold logic of it made Chen sick. These Special Forces operators had allowed Captain Morrison's convoy to walk into a trap so they could gather intelligence about a suspected traitor in the American ranks. The wounded men lying in the shade of the damaged Humvee were casualties not just of insurgent violence, but of a larger intelligence operation that treated soldiers like pieces on a chessboard. So we were bait, Chen said flatly. You were doing your job, Sullivan corrected. The fact that insurgents had advance warning of your mission confirms what we suspected. Now we can take action to plug the leak and prevent future casualties. Before Chen could respond, the team's communications specialist came over with a radio handset. Major, we're getting priority traffic from higher. They want a full sitrep on the intelligence gather. Sullivan took the handset and moved a few steps away, speaking in low tones that Chen couldn't make out. But he could see from the Major's body language that the conversation was intense and urgent. Whatever information they had gathered from this operation was significant enough to warrant immediate attention from very senior levels of command. The team medic approached Chen, stripping off her latex gloves. We're ready to move your casualties. My recommendation is to get them to the combat surgical hospital at Balad as quickly as possible. The helicopter ride will be rough, but they should all make it if we don't delay any longer. Chen nodded, grateful that at least his wounded soldiers would receive proper medical care. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he and his men had been used in a way that violated everything he believed about military leadership and the obligation to protect soldiers under your command. As the Special Operations team began loading the wounded onto their helicopters, Chen noticed something that made him even more uneasy. These weren't standard military medical evacuation aircraft. They were heavily modified with additional communications equipment, defensive systems, and what looked like intelligence-gathering apparatus. This was a multi-mission platform designed for much more than simple rescue operations. Major Sullivan returned from his radio conversation and walked over to where Chen was standing. Sergeant, I want you to understand something. What happened here today was unfortunate, but it was necessary. The intelligence we've gathered will save lives in the long run. Chen looked at him steadily. Will it save Captain Morrison's life? What about Johnson and Martinez? Was their suffering worth your intelligence operation? Sullivan's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Chen saw something human beneath the professional special operations demeanor. I've been doing this for 15 years, Sergeant. Every mission involves choices that no one should have to make. We do what we can to minimize casualties while accomplishing objectives that serve the greater good. It's never perfect, and it's never easy. As the last of the wounded soldiers was loaded onto the helicopters, Chen realized that he would probably never learn the full truth about what had happened today. The classified nature of Sullivan's operation meant that most details would remain hidden in files that regular soldiers like himself would never see. But he had learned enough to know that the war in Iraq involved levels of complexity and moral ambiguity that went far beyond the simple mission briefings and rules of engagement that governed his daily duties. One of Sullivan's team members came over and handed Chen a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit. This is a secure communication device, the soldier explained. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this again, activate it and we'll know where you are. Consider it insurance. Chen turned the device over in his hands, examining its unmarked surface and unfamiliar controls. Who do I tell my superiors gave this to me? You don't, Sullivan replied. As far as anyone knows, it's a piece of salvaged equipment you picked up from the damaged convoy. Keep it with your personal gear and hope you never have to use it. The helicopters were beginning to spin up their rotors, preparing for departure. Sullivan shook Chen's hand firmly, his grip conveying both respect and a kind of warning. Remember what I told you about this operation being classified. For the safety of ongoing intelligence activities and for the protection of sources and methods, everything you've seen here today remains strictly need to know. Chen nodded, understanding the implicit threat behind the words. Special operations units had ways of ensuring that sensitive information remained protected, and crossing them would not be wise for a regular army sergeant with a family back home and a career to protect. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying the wounded soldiers toward medical treatment and safety, Chen stood in the middle of the desert watching them disappear into the afternoon heat haze. Rodriguez and the other soldiers from his unit were gathering their equipment and preparing to return to their base, but Chen remained motionless, processing everything he had witnessed. The sound of the rotors faded into the distance, leaving only the whistling of wind across the desert sand and the creaking of cooling metal from the damaged convoy vehicles. In a few hours, a recovery team would arrive to salvage what they could and destroy the rest, erasing most physical evidence of what had happened here. The official reports would describe a routine ambush and a successful rescue by conventional forces, with no mention of special operations involvement or intelligence-gathering activities. But Chen knew that the real story was far more complicated and disturbing than anything that would appear in the official record. Somewhere in the American command structure, someone with access to sensitive operational information was betraying that trust and putting soldiers' lives at risk for money or ideology or some other motivation that Chen couldn't fathom. The attack on Captain Morrison's convoy had been orchestrated by someone who wore the same uniform and took the same oath that Chen had sworn to uphold. Rodriguez walked over and stood beside him, looking out at the horizon where the helicopters had disappeared. "Sergeant, what do we tell the debriefing team when we get back to base?" Chen considered the question carefully. The truth was complex and classified, involving ongoing intelligence operations that could be compromised if details leaked out. But the sanitized version that Major Sullivan wanted him to report felt like a betrayal of his wounded soldiers and a cover-up of serious security breaches that needed to be addressed. "We tell them exactly what happened," Chen decided. "We responded to a convoy in distress, provided what assistance we could, and waited until medical evacuation arrived. Everything else is above our pay grade." It was a compromise that satisfied neither his desire for honesty nor his obligation to protect classified information, but it was the best he could do under circumstances that he had never been trained to handle. Regular soldiers weren't supposed to get caught up in intelligence operations and moral dilemmas that had no clear right answers. As they began the drive back to their base, Chen found himself thinking about Captain Morrison and the other wounded soldiers who were now on their way to medical treatment. They would survive their physical injuries and eventually return to duty or go home to their families, but they would never know the full truth about why they had been targeted or how their suffering had served a larger purpose in the shadowy world of military intelligence operations. The secure communication device that Sullivan's team member had given him felt heavy in Chen's pocket, a tangible reminder that his involvement in this incident was far from over. By accepting the device, he had essentially been recruited into a network of soldiers who operated in the gray areas between official military operations and classified intelligence activities. He might never hear from them again, or he might find himself called upon to participate in operations that he couldn't discuss with his superiors or even his closest friends. The desert landscape rolled past their Humvee windows as they made their way back to base, looking exactly as it had that morning when they had driven out to meet Captain Morrison's convoy. But Chen knew that everything had changed for him during those few hours in the sun. He had seen behind the curtain of official military operations and discovered a world where soldiers were sometimes sacrificed for intelligence purposes and where the truth was subordinated to operational security. As the sun began to set and the temperature finally started to drop from its afternoon peak, Chen made a mental note to research everything he could about intelligence operations in Iraq and the methods used to identify security breaches. If he was going to be involved in this world, even peripherally, he needed to understand the rules and the stakes involved. The lights of their base appeared ahead, bringing promise of air conditioning, cold water, and the familiar routines of military life. But Chen knew that he would never again be able to participate in those routines with quite the same innocence or trust in the system that he had felt that morning. He had learned that the war in Iraq involved levels of deception and sacrifice that went far beyond anything he had imagined, and that knowledge would stay with him for the rest of his military career and beyond. 3 weeks after the incident in the desert, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen was sitting in his quarters at Forward Operating Base Liberty, staring at the secure communication device that Major Sullivan's team had given him. The small black unit had remained silent since that day, showing no signs of activity or incoming messages, but Chen found himself checking it several times each day. Something about the way Sullivan had spoken suggested that their encounter was far from over. The official after-action reports from the convoy incident had been filed and accepted without question. Captain Morrison was recovering from his head injury at a military hospital in Germany, showing good progress, but still dealing with memory issues related to his concussion. Private Johnson had undergone surgery to repair his broken arm and internal injuries, and Corporal Martinez was healing from his burns with minimal scarring expected. The entire incident had been classified as a routine insurgent attack with successful casualty evacuation by conventional forces. But Chen knew better. Over the past 3 weeks, he had been conducting his own quiet investigation into intelligence leaks and security breaches in the Baghdad sector. Using his access to military databases and his network of contacts throughout the army, he had begun to piece together a pattern of incidents that suggested the convoy attack was part of a much larger problem. Rodriguez had been helping with the research, using his language skills to monitor insurgent radio traffic and his computer expertise to analyze communication patterns. What they had discovered was deeply troubling. Over the past 6 months, at least 12 military operations in their sector had been compromised in ways that suggested advance warning to insurgent forces. Ambushes had been waiting at exactly the right locations. Roadside bombs had been placed along routes that were supposed to be classified, and safe houses had been abandoned just before planned raids. Someone with high-level access to operational planning was systematically betraying American military operations to the enemy. The scope and consistency of the leaks suggested this wasn't a matter of poor operational security or accidentally intercepted communications. This was deliberate treason by someone in a position of significant trust and authority. Chen was reviewing the latest data when Rodriguez burst into the quarters, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Sergeant, I just picked up something on the insurgent frequency. They're planning something big for tonight, and they're talking about getting specific intelligence from their source inside the American base." Chen grabbed his notebook and pen. "What exactly did you hear?" "They mentioned a supply convoy that's supposed to leave the base at 600 tomorrow morning. But here's the thing, Sergeant. That convoy movement hasn't been announced yet. I checked with the motor pool, and they only finalized the route and timing 2 hours ago. The paperwork hasn't even been distributed to the security teams yet." The implications were staggering. If insurgents already knew about a convoy movement that had been planned just hours earlier, their source wasn't just someone with general access to operational information. It was someone with immediate, real-time access to the highest levels of mission planning. That narrowed the field of suspects considerably, but it also made the situation much more dangerous. Chen picked up the secure communication device, examining its unmarked surface and wondering if he should activate it. Major Sullivan had told him to use it only in emergency situations, but if Rodriguez was right about the insurgents having advance warning of tomorrow's convoy, this definitely qualified as an emergency. Before he could make a decision, the device suddenly came to life, emitting a soft beeping sound and displaying a series of numbers on its small screen. Chen had no idea what the numbers meant, but their appearance couldn't be a coincidence. Somehow, Major Sullivan's people were monitoring the situation and had chosen this moment to make contact. Chen pressed what looked like a transmit button and spoke quietly into the device. "This is Echo 4. I'm reading your signal." The response came back immediately, in a voice he didn't recognize but with the same professional tone he remembered from Sullivan's team. "Echo 4, this is Control. We need to meet tonight. Grid reference follows." A series of coordinates appeared on the device's screen, indicating a location about 5 miles outside the base perimeter. Chen memorized the numbers quickly, then watched as they disappeared from the display. Whatever meeting Sullivan's people wanted, it was going to take place in a location that was both secure and isolated from potential surveillance. "Control, I'll be there," Chen transmitted back. Come alone, 2200 hours. Use standard patrol justification if questioned about your movement. The device went silent again, leaving Chen staring at its blank screen and wondering what he was getting himself into. Meeting with unknown special operations personnel outside the base perimeter was a serious breach of protocol that could end his military career if discovered. But the alternative, allowing insurgents to continue receiving intelligence that would lead to more American casualties, was unacceptable. Rodriguez was watching him with growing concern. "Sergeant, what was that?" Chen made a quick decision. "Rodriguez, I need you to monitor insurgent traffic tonight and document everything you hear about tomorrow's convoy or any other operations. If something happens to me, take that information directly to Colonel Patterson and tell him everything we've discovered about the intelligence leaks." "What do you mean, if something happens to you?" Chen was already gathering his equipment and checking his weapon. "I'm meeting with the people who rescued Morrison's convoy. They want to discuss the security breaches we've identified." Rodriguez looked alarmed. "Sir, shouldn't we report this through normal channels? If there's a traitor in the command structure, there are procedures for handling that kind of investigation." Chen had considered the same question, but he had reached a troubling conclusion. "The normal channels have been compromised, Rodriguez. Whoever is feeding information to the insurgents has access to our intelligence reports and investigation procedures. If we report this through regular command channels, we'll be telling the traitor exactly what we know and how we know it." As the sun set and darkness began to fall across the Iraqi desert, Chen prepared for what could be the most important meeting of his military career. He studied maps of the area around the designated coordinates, planned his route to avoid security checkpoints, and prepared a cover story that would explain his absence from the base if anyone asked questions. The meeting location was an abandoned building complex that had once been a small factory or warehouse operation. Chen arrived exactly on time, parking his vehicle about a quarter-mile away and approaching on foot using night vision equipment. The area appeared deserted, but he knew that special operations personnel could remain virtually invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. "Echo 4. The voice came from directly behind him, causing Chen to spin around in surprise. A figure emerged from shadows that Chen would have sworn were empty moments before. It was Major Sullivan, dressed in desert camouflage and carrying equipment that Chen didn't recognize. "Major," Chen acknowledged, grateful that his voice remained steady despite his startled nerves. "Walk with me," Sullivan said, leading the way toward the abandoned buildings. As they moved through the darkness, Sullivan began speaking in low tones that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate vicinity. "We've been monitoring the situation since our last encounter. Your investigation into intelligence leaks has been noted and appreciated." Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "You've been watching us." "We've been watching everyone," Sullivan replied matter-of-factly. "The security breaches you've identified are part of a larger pattern that threatens multiple ongoing operations. We believe we've identified the source of the leaks, but we need your help to gather definitive proof." They entered one of the abandoned buildings, where Chen could see that Sullivan's team had established a temporary command center. Banks of electronic equipment lined makeshift tables, and several operators were monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously. This wasn't a simple meeting, it was a full-scale intelligence operation. Sullivan led Chen to an area where aerial photographs and military organizational charts covered an entire wall. "The person we suspect has access to operational planning at the brigade level, real-time communication with insurgent networks, and the technical capability to intercept and decrypt classified transmissions." Chen studied the charts, trying to identify the positions that would provide that level of access and capability. The number of possibilities was smaller than he had expected, but still included several dozen officers and senior enlisted personnel who worked in intelligence, operations, and communications roles. "Do you have any suspects?" Sullivan asked. Chen hesitated, unsure how much he should reveal about his own investigation. But the equipment and expertise displayed in the command center convinced him that Sullivan's people were legitimate American intelligence operatives, not insurgent sympathizers or foreign agents. "We've identified 3 people who had advanced knowledge of all the operations that were compromised," Chen admitted. "But all 3 have top-secret clearances and sterling service records, It's hard to believe any of them would turn traitor. Sullivan nodded grimly. The best double agents always have impeccable credentials. That's what makes them so valuable to the enemy and so dangerous to us. One of Sullivan's team members approached with a tablet computer displaying what looked like intercepted communications data. Major, we're getting confirmation on the source location. The transmission point is definitely inside the base perimeter, and the signal characteristics match equipment that's only available to senior intelligence personnel. Sullivan studied the data for a moment, then looked back at Chen. Tomorrow's convoy operation is going to proceed as planned, but with modifications that the suspected traitor won't know about. We're going to use the convoy as bait to draw out the person who's been feeding information to the insurgents. Chen felt his stomach drop. Sir, you're putting those soldiers at risk again. We're putting them at calculated risk in order to eliminate a threat that will otherwise continue to compromise operations indefinitely, Sullivan corrected. The convoy will have covert protection that the traitor won't know about, and will be monitoring all communications to identify exactly how and when classified information is being transmitted to insurgent forces. The plan was tactically sound, but ethically troubling. Once again, regular soldiers would be used as unwitting participants in an intelligence operation designed to flush out a suspected traitor. Chen understood the logic, but he couldn't shake the feeling that using soldiers as bait violated fundamental principles of military leadership. What do you need from me? Chen asked. Sullivan handed him a small electronic device that looked like a standard military radio, but was clearly much more sophisticated. This will allow you to monitor our communications during tomorrow's operation. We need someone inside the regular command structure who can observe how information flows and identify any anomalies in the intelligence dissemination process. Chen examined the device, noting its unmarked surface and unfamiliar controls. Am I going to be in danger? If our suspected traitor realizes that we're closing in, they may take desperate action to protect themselves or eliminate potential witnesses. Stay alert, trust no one completely, and be prepared to defend yourself if necessary. As the meeting concluded, and Chen prepared to return to base, Sullivan gave him one final piece of information that changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. The person we suspect isn't just selling information for money. We believe they're part of a larger network that includes American citizens who are actively working to undermine military operations in Iraq for political reasons. The implications were staggering. Chen had assumed that any intelligence leak would be motivated by financial gain or personal grudges, not ideological opposition to American foreign policy. If Sullivan was right, the traitor was part of a coordinated effort by American citizens to sabotage their own country's military operations. How do you know this? Chen asked. Because we've been tracking the network for over a year, Sullivan replied. The intelligence leaks in your sector are just one part of a much larger operation that includes media manipulation, propaganda distribution, and coordination with foreign intelligence services. The person feeding information to insurgents here is taking orders from people in the United States who want American military operations to fail. Chen drove back to base in stunned silence, trying to process the idea that American citizens were actively working to undermine their own country's military efforts. He had always known that the war in Iraq was politically controversial, but he had never imagined that opposition would extend to actual sabotage of military operations and deliberate endangerment of soldiers' lives. The secure radio device that Sullivan had given him was hidden in his personal equipment, ready to be activated when tomorrow's convoy operation began. Chen would be monitoring the communications and watching for signs that classified information was being leaked to insurgent forces, potentially identifying the traitor who had been responsible for so much death and suffering. But as he lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of soldiers preparing for another day in a combat zone, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's operation would change everything for him once again. He was being drawn deeper into a world of intelligence operations and political intrigue that went far beyond the straightforward military duties he had signed up to perform. The war in Iraq was far more complex and morally ambiguous than he had ever imagined, involving not just foreign enemies but domestic threats that challenged everything he believed about patriotism, duty, and the obligations of citizenship. Tomorrow, he would play a role in exposing those threats, but he suspected that the knowledge he gained would burden him for the rest of his life. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen was positioned in the base operations center at 5:30 the next morning, ostensibly reviewing convoy security protocols, but actually monitoring the special communications device that Major Sullivan had given him. The morning briefing had proceeded normally, with standard intelligence updates and routine security warnings that gave no indication of the complex operation that was about to unfold. The supply convoy was scheduled to depart at 600, following a route that had been classified and distributed only to essential personnel within the past 12 hours. Chen watched carefully as various officers and enlisted personnel received their briefings and assignments, looking for any behavior that might indicate someone was secretly communicating with outside contacts. Colonel Patterson, the base commander, was reviewing final convoy details with his staff when Chen noticed something troubling. Master Sergeant Lisa Hawkins, the senior intelligence analyst, was taking notes during the briefing using a tablet computer that she occasionally touched in ways that seemed inconsistent with normal note-taking. Her fingers moved across the screen in patterns that looked more like text messaging than document editing. Chen had worked with Hawkins for 6 months and had always respected her professionalism and expertise. She had 15 years of military intelligence experience, multiple commendations for outstanding service, and a top-secret security clearance that had been renewed just 18 months earlier. The idea that she might be the traitor seemed almost impossible to believe. But as Chen watched more carefully, he noticed other details that raised his suspicions. Hawkins was sitting positioned so that she could see the main briefing displays while remaining partially hidden from direct observation by other personnel. Her tablet was angled in a way that made it difficult for anyone else to see what she was typing. And most significantly, she was taking notes about details that weren't being discussed in the official briefing, details that would only be known to someone with access to classified operational planning. The special radio device suddenly activated, displaying a brief message. "Monitor Target 7. Chen quickly consulted the personnel roster he had memorized and confirmed that Hawkins was indeed Target 7 on the list of suspected security risks. Sullivan's team was apparently watching the same behavior that had caught Chen's attention. As the briefing concluded and personnel began departing to carry out their assigned duties, Chen followed Hawkins at a discreet distance. She walked directly to her office in the intelligence section, but instead of beginning her normal daily routine, she immediately activated her computer terminal and began accessing classified databases that weren't directly related to her current assignments. Chen positioned himself where he could observe her activities without being obvious about his surveillance. Through careful observation, he could see that Hawkins was reviewing detailed information about convoy routes, timing, security measures, and personnel assignments. But more troubling than what she was accessing was how she was accessing it, using security protocols and database queries that went far beyond her normal job responsibilities. The radio device vibrated softly, indicating an incoming message. Subject making unauthorized data access. Continue observation. Chen confirmed the transmission and settled in to maintain surveillance of Hawkins' activities. Over the next 30 minutes, he watched as she systematically gathered information about not just today's convoy, but several other planned operations over the coming weeks. She was downloading data files, copying communication protocols, and accessing personnel records that had no connection to her legitimate intelligence duties. At 5:45, just 15 minutes before the convoy was scheduled to depart, Hawkins suddenly stood up and walked quickly toward the bathroom. But instead of entering the women's restroom, she continued down the hallway toward an exit that led to a relatively isolated area behind the communications building. Chen followed at a distance, using his radio to update Sullivan's team on the developing situation. Control Echo 4. Target 7 is moving to secondary location. Appears to be heading for external communication point. Copy Echo 4. Maintain visual contact but do not engage. We're moving into position for intercept. Chen reached the exit door just in time to see Hawkins walking toward a small maintenance building that housed backup communication equipment. She was carrying a small device that looked like a satellite phone, definitely not standard military issue, and not something that a master sergeant should have in her personal possession. As Chen watched from behind a concrete barrier, Hawkins activated the device and began speaking in low tones. He couldn't make out the specific words, but her body language suggested she was providing detailed information to whoever was listening. The call lasted approximately 3 minutes, during which time Hawkins repeatedly consulted notes she had written during the morning briefing. When the call ended, Hawkins looked around carefully to ensure she wasn't being observed, then began walking back toward the main base area. Chen waited until she was well away from the maintenance building before moving closer to examine the area where she had made her transmission. The ground around the building showed clear evidence of regular use, footprints in patterns that suggested Hawkins had been using this location for covert communications over an extended period. Chen also noticed that the building's exterior had several small antennas and communication cables that weren't part of the standard military communication infrastructure. The radio device activated again. Echo 4, this is Control. Target 7 has returned to normal activities, but we intercepted her transmission. Insurgent forces are being directed to specific ambush positions along the convoy route. Operation is confirmed. She's definitely our leak. Chen felt a mixture of satisfaction at finally identifying the traitor and disgust at the confirmation that a fellow soldier had been systematically betraying American military operations. Master Sergeant Hawkins had sworn the same oath that Chen had taken, promising to defend the Constitution and protect her fellow soldiers. Instead, she had been selling them out to enemies who wanted to kill them. The convoy departed on schedule, but Chen knew that Sullivan's team would be monitoring the route and protecting the soldiers from any insurgent ambushes that Hawkins' intelligence might enable. Meanwhile, Chen was instructed to continue observing Hawkins' behavior and documenting any additional evidence of her treasonous activities. Over the next several hours, Chen watched as Hawkins performed her normal duties with apparent competence and professionalism. She interacted normally with other personnel, completed routine intelligence reports, and participated in scheduled briefings as if she had never betrayed classified information to enemy forces. Her ability to compartmentalize her treason and maintain a facade of loyalty was both impressive and deeply disturbing. At 1400 hours, the radio device delivered an update that changed everything. Echo 4, convoy operation successful. No casualties. 3 insurgent cells neutralized by Overwatch teams. Target 7's intelligence led directly to enemy positions, confirming her complicity. Chen realized that Sullivan's team had used Hawkins' leaked information as a trap, allowing insurgents to position themselves for ambushes that would never succeed because Delta Force or other special operations units were waiting for them. The convoy had been protected by covert security that Hawkins didn't know about, and her intelligence leaks had actually led insurgent forces into carefully planned killing zones. But the operation was far from over. The radio device soon delivered new instructions. Echo 4, we need to maintain surveillance until we can gather evidence of her network contacts. Do not let her know she's been compromised. Chen spent the rest of the afternoon watching Hawkins with growing unease. Now that he knew for certain she was a traitor, every interaction felt dangerous and surreal. When she asked him routine questions about security procedures or commented on intelligence reports, Chen had to suppress his anger and disgust while responding normally. Late in the afternoon, Chen noticed that Hawkins seemed increasingly nervous and distracted. She checked her watch frequently, made several personal phone calls, and repeatedly accessed her computer terminal to review news reports and communication logs. Something was making her anxious, and Chen suspected she might be receiving pressure from her insurgent contacts about the failed ambush attempts. At 1800 hours, as the base was transitioning to evening operations, Hawkins once again walked toward the maintenance building where Chen had observed her making her morning transmission. This time, Chen was ready with a small recording device that Sullivan's team had provided, capable of intercepting and documenting satellite phone communications. Hawkins' evening conversation was much longer and more intense than her morning transmission. Even without being able to hear specific words, Chen could tell from her body language that she was being questioned aggressively about why the convoy ambushes had failed. Her responses seemed defensive and increasingly agitated, suggesting that her insurgent contacts were not pleased with the day's results. When the call ended, Hawkins remained at the communications site for several additional minutes, apparently trying to regain her composure before returning to the main base area. Chen used this time to activate his recording equipment and attempt to capture any residual electronic signals from her satellite phone transmission. The radio device activated with urgent instructions. Echo 4, we've intercepted enough communications to confirm the full network. Prepare for immediate arrest operation. Targets 7 and 3, additional personnel will be taken into custody within the next hour. Chen felt his heart rate increase as he realized that the investigation had revealed multiple traitors within the base command structure. Master Sergeant Hawkins was not operating alone. She was part of a cell of military personnel who were systematically betraying American operations to insurgent forces. As Chen made his way back toward the main base area, he saw signs of unusual activity that confirmed the impending arrests. Military police units were moving into position near key buildings. Additional security personnel were establishing checkpoints at base exits, and several officers were conducting what appeared to be urgent consultations with senior commanders. At 1945 hours, Chen watched from the operations center as military police arrested Master Sergeant Hawkins at her duty station. She showed no resistance, but also no surprise, as if she had been expecting this moment. 2 other arrests occurred simultaneously in different parts of the base: a captain from the communications section and a staff sergeant from the motor pool who had access to convoy routing information. The radio device delivered a final message from Sullivan's team. Echo 4, operation complete. Your assistance has been invaluable in protecting American lives and maintaining operational security. All evidence will be turned over to appropriate authorities for prosecution. As Chen watched Hawkins being escorted away in handcuffs, he felt no satisfaction or sense of victory. The successful identification and arrest of the traitors was a necessary achievement, but the knowledge that fellow soldiers had been willing to betray their comrades for money or ideology was profoundly disturbing. Colonel Patterson addressed the base personnel that evening, explaining that a security investigation had resulted in arrests for espionage and treason, but providing no details about the scope of the betrayal or the methods used to identify the perpetrators. The official story would minimize the extent of the intelligence compromise and avoid any mention of the special operations involvement that had made the investigation possible. Chen knew that he would never be able to discuss the full details of what he had witnessed and participated in. The classified nature of Sullivan's operation meant that his role in identifying and monitoring the traitors would remain forever hidden in files that regular military personnel would never see. But as he lay in his bunk that night, Chen reflected on the lessons he had learned about the complex nature of modern warfare and the multiple threats that soldiers faced in places like Iraq. The enemy wasn't just insurgents with roadside bombs and small arms. It was also fellow Americans who were willing to betray their own country's military operations for personal or political reasons. The war in Iraq involved moral and ethical challenges that went far beyond anything taught in basic training or officer candidate school. Chen had been forced to make decisions and participate in operations that tested his fundamental beliefs about loyalty, duty, and the obligations of military service. The knowledge he had gained would burden him for the rest of his career, but he knew it would also make him a more effective soldier and leader. 6 months after the arrests at Forward Operating Base Liberty, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen found himself standing in a secure briefing room at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, facing a panel of senior military officers and civilian intelligence officials. The investigation that had begun with a disabled convoy in the Iraqi desert had expanded into one of the largest espionage cases in modern military history. Major Sullivan, who Chen now knew was actually Lieutenant Colonel David Sullivan from the Army's Intelligence and Security Command, sat at the end of the conference table with a thick folder of classified documents. The weeks following the arrests had revealed the full scope of the treason that had been occurring within American military operations in Iraq. "Sergeant Chen," began Brigadier General Margaret Foster, the presiding officer, "your actions in identifying and monitoring the intelligence leak at FOB Liberty directly led to the disruption of a network that was responsible for compromising over 40 military operations and causing the deaths of at least 18 American service members." Chen remained at attention, still processing the magnitude of what they had uncovered. Master Sergeant Lisa Hawkins had not been operating independently. She was part of a sophisticated espionage network that included military personnel at bases throughout Iraq, civilian contractors with security clearances, and American citizens operating from locations in the United States. The network was being directed by a group calling itself the American Peace Coalition, General Foster continued. They believed they were justified in undermining military operations as a form of protest against what they considered an illegal and immoral war. Chen had read the intelligence reports about the Peace Coalition during his preparation for this briefing. The group consisted primarily of former military personnel, anti-war activists, and political radicals who had decided that traditional protest methods were insufficient to end American involvement in Iraq. Their solution had been to actively sabotage military operations by providing intelligence to insurgent forces. What made this network particularly dangerous, added Mr. James Crawford, a senior analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency, was their sophisticated understanding of military operations and their ability to blend ideological motivation with professional competence. These weren't amateur protesters. They were trained military personnel who knew exactly how to cause maximum damage to American capabilities. Sullivan opened his folder and began presenting evidence that Chen had never seen before. Bank records showed that Hawkins and her co-conspirators had received substantial payments for their intelligence services, but the money had been funneled through charitable organizations and political action committees that appeared legitimate on the surface. The financial trail led us to discover that the Peace Coalition was receiving funding from foreign intelligence services, particularly Syrian and Iranian agencies that wanted to destabilize American operations in Iraq, Sullivan explained. What started as domestic political protest had evolved into actual foreign-sponsored espionage. Chen listened with growing amazement as the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. The network had been operating for over 2 years, systematically identifying military personnel who might be sympathetic to anti-war messages and recruiting them through a combination of ideological persuasion and financial incentives. The recruitment process was particularly insidious, Crawford noted. They would target military personnel who had expressed doubts about the war, soldiers who were having financial difficulties, or individuals who felt underappreciated by their commanders. The initial approach always appeared to be legitimate political discussion or offer of assistance. Chen thought about his own interactions with Hawkins during the months before her arrest. She had occasionally made comments about the futility of the war and the waste of American lives, but her statements had seemed within the bounds of normal soldier complaints rather than signs of active disloyalty. How were they able to operate undetected for so long? Chen asked. General Foster exchanged a look with Sullivan before answering. Because they understood how our security systems work and how to exploit their weaknesses. They knew which communications channels were monitored and which ones weren't. They understood how intelligence reports were distributed and how to access information without triggering automatic security alerts. Sullivan added, they also benefited from our assumptions about loyalty and patriotism. The idea that American military personnel would actively work to undermine their own operations was so contrary to military culture that most security procedures didn't account for it adequately. The briefing continued for several hours, covering details about the arrests, interrogations, and ongoing legal proceedings against the network members. Chen learned that over 30 people had been charged with espionage, treason, and related crimes, including several high-ranking officers who had been providing intelligence about strategic planning and force deployment. What happened to Captain Morrison and the other soldiers from the convoy? Chen asked. Captain Morrison made a full recovery and has returned to active duty, General Foster replied. Private Johnson and Corporal Martinez have also recovered from their injuries. All three have been briefed about the true nature of the attack that wounded them, and they've been sworn to secrecy about the classified aspects of the investigation. Chen felt relief that his fellow soldiers had survived their ordeal, but he also felt anger that they had been wounded as a result of betrayal by their own comrades. The knowledge that American soldiers were deliberately providing intelligence that led to attacks on other Americans was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Sergeant Chen, we want to offer you an opportunity, Sullivan said, opening a different folder. Your performance during this investigation has demonstrated exceptional capability in intelligence operations and counterintelligence activities. We'd like to offer you specialized training and assignment to units that deal with similar threats. Chen considered the offer carefully. The past 6 months had given him insights into aspects of military service that most soldiers never experienced, but they had also shown him the moral complexity and emotional burden that came with intelligence work. "What kind of assignment are we talking about?" Chen asked. "Initially, you would attend the Army's counterintelligence agent course and other specialized training programs," Crawford explained. "After that, you could be assigned to units that investigate security breaches, conduct counterespionage operations, or work with special operations forces on sensitive missions." Chen thought about Rodriguez, who was still serving in Iraq, and the other soldiers he had known who continued to perform their duties without any knowledge of the complex intelligence operations that surrounded their daily activities. Part of him wanted to return to that simpler world where the enemy was clearly identifiable and the mission was straightforward. "Can I have some time to consider the offer?" Chen asked. General Foster nodded. "Take all the time you need, Sergeant, but understand that your knowledge of this case and your demonstrated capabilities make you a valuable asset in protecting American military operations from internal threats." As the briefing concluded, Chen was given additional classified documents to review, including detailed reports about the network's activities and the ongoing prosecution of the arrested personnel. He learned that Hawkins and 2 other ringleaders were facing potential death sentences for treason, while the other network members were likely to receive lengthy prison terms. That evening, Chen sat in his temporary quarters at Fort Bragg, reading through the case files and trying to process everything he had learned about the nature of modern warfare and the threats that American military personnel faced from their own countrymen. The secure communication device that Sullivan had given him in Iraq was sitting on his desk, now deactivated, but serving as a reminder of how much his life had changed since that day in the desert. Rodriguez called that night from Iraq, speaking carefully because he knew their conversation would be monitored and recorded. "How was your briefing at Bragg?" he asked. "Educational," Chen replied. "I learned a lot about the bigger picture of what we've been dealing with over there." "Are you coming back to finish out your tour?" Chen looked at the assignment offer that Sullivan had left with him. "I'm not sure yet. There might be other opportunities that would let me continue working on similar issues." After the call ended, Chen walked outside into the North Carolina evening, breathing air that didn't carry the dust and heat of the Iraqi desert. The normalcy of the American military base was almost surreal after months of living in a combat environment where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. He thought about Captain Morrison, still recovering from injuries that had been caused not by foreign enemies, but by fellow Americans who had decided that their political beliefs justified betraying their comrades. He thought about Private Johnson and Corporal Martinez, who would carry scars for the rest of their lives as reminders of that betrayal. Most of all, he thought about the other soldiers still serving in Iraq and Afghanistan and other dangerous places around the world, most of whom would never know about the complex web of intelligence operations and counterintelligence activities that worked to protect them from threats both foreign and domestic. Chen made his decision that night, walking back to his quarters and drafting a letter accepting Sullivan's offer of specialized training and assignment to counterintelligence operations. He knew that the work would involve moral complexities and emotional burdens that regular military service didn't include, but he also knew that someone had to do it. 3 months later, Chen graduated from the counterintelligence agent course and was assigned to a unit that investigated security breaches and potential espionage within military organizations. His first major case involved suspected intelligence leaks at a military installation in Afghanistan, where insurgents seemed to have advance warning of planned operations. As he sat in another desert, this time in Afghanistan rather than Iraq, monitoring another suspected traitor and preparing to gather evidence of betrayal by American military personnel, Chen reflected on how much his understanding of military service had evolved since that day when Captain Morrison's convoy had been attacked. The war against terrorism wasn't just a matter of fighting foreign enemies in distant countries. It was also a struggle to maintain the integrity and loyalty of American military institutions against internal threats posed by people who wore the same uniform and had taken the same oath, but had decided that their personal beliefs superseded their professional obligations. Chen's secure communication device activated, displaying coordinates for a meeting with a local special operations team that would help him investigate the latest security breach. As he prepared to meet with another group of elite soldiers operating in the shadows to protect their comrades, Chen knew that his war would continue long after the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan ended. The enemy wasn't just hiding in caves or building roadside bombs. Sometimes the enemy was sitting in the next chair during morning briefings, taking notes that would be used to kill American soldiers. Identifying and stopping those internal threats required a different kind of courage and a different kind of sacrifice. But Chen had learned that it was just as important as facing foreign enemies in direct combat. Rodriguez had asked him once why he had chosen to get involved in intelligence operations instead of returning to regular army duties. Chen's answer was simple: because someone had to stand guard against the Guardians, to watch the Watchers, and to ensure that American military personnel could trust their comrades with their lives. The desert night was quiet except for the distant sound of helicopters and the soft beeping of his communication device, reminding Chen that somewhere in the darkness, other soldiers were depending on him to protect them from threats they would never see coming. It was a responsibility he had never asked for but had learned to accept as part of serving something larger than himself.